Chemical pollution is often invisible, but unfortunately it doesn't disappear. Across Europe, soils and groundwater are contaminated by persistent chemicals such as PFAS and other industrial pollutants. Some of these substances remain in the environment for decades, even centuries, and pose long-term risks to ecosystems, drinking water, and human health. How widespread is chemical soil contamination in Europe? Where are the most critical hotspots? And what can research and regulation do to reduce the risks? Few are better positioned to talk about these subjects than today's guest, Hans Peter Arp. He is researcher at NGI and NTNU and an internationally recognized expert on chemical pollution, contaminated soils, and environmental risks. He is involved in several European research projects focusing on contaminated land across Europe and scientific tools, policy guidance, and alternatives assessments to support Europe's zero pollution ambition. Hans Peter also serves as an independent member of the management board of the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, helping shape European chemicals policy. Welcome, Hans Peter. You're a busy man.
No, welcome, Liv. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
To start broadly, how would you describe the current situation when it comes to chemical contamination of soils and groundwater in Europe?
Well, the situation, frankly, it's not good. And I think it can be hard for people to understand this if they do not live directly in an area where their soil or their groundwater is not contaminated. But this applies to many people throughout Europe. And just some numbers to show the extent. The European Environment Agency projects that there are nearly 3 million contaminated sites in Europe, with 1.38 million of those confirmed by the EU member countries, and the rest are just likely contaminated sites, but we have no data. But based on land use, we can only assume. And these vary. They can be mining sites, industrial processing sites, such as brownfield sites. And specifically, I'm also looking at a lot of the PFAS contaminated sites, which are these, often referred to as forever chemicals, which will stay around in soils for a long time, contaminating plants and groundwater and the people in that community that live on that contaminated area. By a collaboration I did once with the Forever Pollution Project, which is a network of journalists who were asking and, ringing people up to find out how many PFAS contaminated sites are in their countries. They had about 23,000 confirmed polluted PFAS sites in the EU member states, and they just based on land use, they presume there's at least another 21,000 more contaminated sites. And and one thing that is kind of special about polluted soil is this a very local problem. If you don't have polluted soil, as I said, you might not think about it, but if you do live there, it can be quite challenging. And over my career in past years, I've heard emotional testimony from people living in places like Korsør, Denmark, a PFAS polluted site, or in Zwijndrecht in Belgium. And they know they're contaminated, their soil is contaminated, and they have a lot of questions about their health and what they can do. Often they feel trapped because they cannot sell or use their land, and they don't know how to live with the soil. So it is a serious problem, and maybe one that should get more attention just because it does cause hardship to a lot of people.
Would you say that this is mainly a historical problem, kind of legacy pollution, or are we still adding significant new contamination today?
Yes and no. Certainly much of the biggest disasters happened in the past before we were aware of the problems. Even go back in historical times. I mean, the early mine sites or the coal sites or the early industrial sites from the industrial revolution, they did not care about human health concerns, environmental concerns the way we do today. But this caused a lot of legacy pollution, particularly from coal and mining. And that's a good deal of activity, actually. So a lot of the polluted sites are from that period. The PFAS pollution and other pollution is a bit more recent, and it is still ongoing. So I would say PFAS pollution is still ongoing, and we need to do something about it. The fact that we are aware of it and on top of it is a sign that it's decreasing. But we also find with the number of unknown sites, there's still many unknown sources of pollution, many unmarked landfills, many secret disposal of toxic waste that sometimes ends up in sludge. But I think at least our awareness and the regulatory tension is making at least the number of new sites, I hope, to become less and fewer in the future.
You have mentioned already some hotspots, Korsør in Denmark, Belgium, and Rastatt in Germany. Are there other hotspots where we can find the most contaminated areas that you would like to mention?
Well, it's hard to say because I mean each site can range. If you give me a type of site like an industry area or a factory, they can range over the full spectrum. Overall, I would say the most contaminated sites or the sites getting priority are those around industrial facilities in highly populated areas, because it's the people not living so far from the emissions, such as the PFAS production facilities in Belgium, Zundrecht or Dordrecht. They've been in operation for decades. Also around coal mining sites previously, people living there, they would cause extreme pollution. But sometimes, it can be surprising. Another site that gets a lot of attention is the Rastatt site in Germany, which is just an agricultural area. But it was someone mixed some PFAS contaminated paper sludge into the normal sludge, which you should never do. And this made a huge contaminated area that was agricultural. But I mean, so hard to say what is the most, but if I were to rank them, I would say usually industry and mining sites were probably the most contaminated, followed by things like unknown sludge, secret landfills, maybe military sites as well. Would be where the most contamination is.
But there's a lack of knowledge here. We don't have enough mapping.
No, we don't have enough mapping, and in the past, this could just be due to the fact that nobody cared, and we find that in a lot of industries, just when they wanted to get rid of their waste, they just secretly disposed of it and driving down a forest road or an unknown site and dumped their toxic waste. Now there's a bit more regulations, but there still could be, a black market for waste. So there's a lot of unknowns. Yeah.
But how does Norway compare to the rest of Europe when it comes to contaminated soil and groundwater?
Well, I would say one special thing about Norway is we are probably blessed with the best nature in Europe. We have a low population density, a lot of natural areas, some of the least inhabited areas. We still have contaminated sites. We do a lot of work on contaminated sites here, but relatively speaking to other places in Europe, we have some of the best soil and groundwater. It's not the most fertile soil due to the climate, but we have the least pollutants, and I think also it's a privilege for me to live and work here is that we also have a very ambitious environmental regulation and politics, I would say also. So even though we have a clean country, we do a lot of work to keep it clean. But it is a different situation than the rest of Europe, I must say.
What kind of risks then do these contaminated hotspots pose for people living nearby, both in the short and the long term?
Yeah, well, if you talk about health concerns, they are widespread. But they can be beyond just health. They can also be environmental and socioeconomic. Sometimes they're clear or hard to link to. But we can go to the data and find a lot of, high rates of cancer for people living near coal processing sites due to the carcinogens. And also, when you look in these cities where, like Zvindrek, that was contaminated with PFAS, I heard testimony from people talking about the large number of miscarriages in their family or sudden cancer death. And it's hard to maybe link this self-reported data to the PFAS. It can, of course, also be other factors. PFAS just, for instance, increases the risk of cancer or miscarriage or other things, but it along with the risk factors. But the thing that it is hard. It's hard to know, and communities are concerned, and it's just hard to know that you're living in an area that might be like that, and you don't know what that means for your children. You don't know what it means for the future of your land. You don't know what to do with your land. You can't, for instance, grow crops on there.
And you can't sell it, probably.
No, they can't sell it. So this is a way of being kind of trapped, I guess, in a way, because they have less opportunities to move out if they wanted to move out. So this is also an addition effect, and this can have like more beyond health effects, but psychological effects as well. So definitely, when you hear that, there just has to be a pathway out, and it takes many people to work together with this. You need it takes a village to help the village of experts and other people that can find solutions. Yeah.
You have already mentioned PFAS, and polyfluoroalkyl substances.
Correct.
They are a large group of human-made chemicals that have received a lot of attention in the recent years. Can you say a bit more what makes PFAS particularly challenging compared to other pollutants?
Yes. Well, PFAS is difficult because it is extremely persistent, and meaning it doesn't biodegrade or degrade in the environment, and therefore it just sticks around and can accumulate in a way that's, you could say, is similar to arsenic or people living near mining communities that have been contaminated with some type of metal. And it just has these unusual properties that also makes it harder than metals, I would say, to do risk assessments. And another variable is that there's a lot of unknowns with PFAS, because they're actually it's a large group of substances, and we find with the narrative that when people were originally looking at PFAS sites, they were only looking at one or two of the PFAS, such as PFOS or PFOA. They're a type of PFAS with 8 carbons, but now there's a lot more attention to the harm of the smaller PFAS. And one I'm particularly interested, just to go on a bit of a tangent, is this one of the smallest ones called trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA. And this is unique because it's very mobile, and we see it going into the plants that are grown on a PFAS contaminated site at a very high concentration. And so basically you can think that when you're living on a site that's contaminated with PFAS, you can have these bioaccumulating ones that will end up in the meat or stick around in your body, or you're going to get these small chain ones that are going to accumulate in the plants that you eat and then the water that you're drinking continuously. And then it gets really hard to do any type of risk assessment, because you have to deal with a very diverse family of chemicals that have different concerns, different impacts, different exposure concentrations, and it just makes it very complex. And particularly about TFA, we find that it's actually spread so fast in the environment, and there's more and more data that shows that essentially every plant on the planet and even every drinking water source is contaminated with TFA, which is a related topic, but won't go too much off tangent. We'll have that for the next podcast, but I'll talk about soil right now. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is scary.
Yes, absolutely.
when we're then thinking in terms of ecosystems, can you say a bit more how chemical pollution impact not only nature, but also the services ecosystems provide us, such as clean drinking water and safe food?
Yeah. Well, yes, absolutely. Like, for instance, maybe just to give some examples, a lot of the pathway of contamination can be through impacts to livestock, such as cows and sheep. For instance, we don't let in Norway sheep graze around former shooting facilities where there was a military site, because there can be a lot of lead and other metals that they'll be in the grasses that will go in the sheep that would eventually we would eat. So this has to be checked. So we do a lot of work at NGI also to try to restore former shooting sites so that, for instance, sheep can graze on them. Also, in the Kursur site, it was actually cows. It was a fire training facility next to a cow pasture, and the community was eating the meat from those cows, and that was a major source. So that whole livestock agriculture had to go away. And also the drinking water. When usually when you're living in a town, for instance, that's contaminated with PFAS, you cannot drink the groundwater. Water would have to be either treated with an extremely expensive technology like reverse osmosis, which costs a lot of money, or until this is available, it would have to be shipped in. So people would have to get not water from their local supply, but brought in by container trucks would be some of the ways it would harm ecosystem services. And I should also mention some of the one of the aspects with PFAS is that when you see a PFAS contaminated site, it doesn't look like the environment is damaged. It's invisible. But if you go to a former mining site or a coal processing site, you will see it looks a bit apocalyptic, and the fact that it kills a lot of the biology, and so you lose a lot of biodiversity in some say mining or former coal processing sites.
You have mentioned a bit about how we deal with this in Norway, but can you say a bit more of how we, through action plans and regulations, deal with contaminated soils in Norway today?
Yes, no, I think in Norway there's a good strategy, and we at NGI have been working a lot with the Norwegian environmental agency, Miljødirektoratet, helping them find guidelines. And also, I'd say if you're interested in this topic or have contaminated land, I would recommend very much to go to the Miljødirektoratet website. They have very good resources and web pages and links to documents, including many of the guidelines that we have written at NGI. But I would say basically how are contaminated soils managed in Norway? Well, it always has to start with monitoring, measuring the contaminants, and there might be certain ways that this monitoring would start. For instance, if you're moving soil or building, you generally have to check if there's any contaminants and to see if they exist certain threshold values that would be considered contaminated. And then if you do, then the next step would just be to discuss what can be done. There are some basic guidances, such as if you have to get rid of the soil, what type of landfill it should be brought to. But it would be also important to have a document with the conversation with the fylke or the Miljødirektoratet to use the tools to see what the risks could be or how to manage properly, and ultimately to make a plan with either the kommune and if necessary, the Miljødirektoratet if it's a bit more tricky. And if there is contaminated land and it needs to be remediated, there's different remediation options that are out there. We at NGI work with them. And I would say for normal questions about soil contamination, there are many competent consultants out there, such as Norconsult or people like that. But if it's a very peculiar, tricky case, that is not textbook, you would want to contact somebody like us at NGI.
But the starting point in most cases, that would be Miljødirektoratet.
Yes, exactly. And looking at the guidance that they provide, and also talk to the local commune about if you have any questions about this. Mm-hmm.
But from a scientific perspective, what would you say works well in the Norwegian system, and where are the biggest gaps or challenges?
Well, I would say one of the challenges that that are there is just generally in terms of risk and risk communication and the tools that we are making and how they're applied. This might sound a bit technical, but I'll just try to say one thing. So we have in Norway a concept called normverdier, or normative values, which is what we consider a safe concentration of a contaminant in soil. So if you're below the normative value, you're fine. And if you're above, you might want to look into it. But sometimes this is misconstrued to mean that if you're exceeding this normative value in your soil, that you have a risk. It doesn't mean that. It means that here you can safely assume that there is no risk. You still can have higher concentrations than these normative values and have no risk, such as if you see high copper, but you could be just in an area where the soil happens to have high copper. And a driving factor is something that we call bioavailability. Even if you have high concentrations, those concentrations might not be bioavailable or posing a risk. And the problem here is if you're sticking too closely to the guidance and not thinking about bioavailability, then what can happen is that you might be overreacting and invest and do remediation that wasn't necessary. And that is something that I refer to as regrettable remediation, and something that should be avoided. Like you shouldn't have to remove soil halfway across the country to a landfill if the contamination was not bioavailable. That's a waste of resources. So that's also something that we're doing in research projects, are trying to find ways to identify the bioavailability of contamination, such as in the research project Aragorn, which is an EU project. We're looking at ways of helping people find guidance about how to really understand if there's a risk in their soils, and what are the best options for mediating them, avoiding regrettable remediation, but also considering other dimensions such as socioeconomic or climate impacts from the remediation activities.
You already mentioned Aragon. Can you say a bit more about this project and why is it needed now? And I understand that one of the aspect is, frankly, to spend the money wisely, not to remediate if it's not needed. Exactly.
Yeah. So Aragorn, that is about achieving restoration and governance of soils, and what we were doing here, in particular in Aragorn, is we wanted to focus on the worst of the worst, so the biggest hotspots and the most contaminant sites, and deal with the most persistent chemicals like PFAS and metals. And we are doing this is because we need to restore this land also for the benefit of the people living there, but also because the alternative is that, that we could be destroying more pristine land for whatever purposes, agriculture or building. And so it's also a very important part of the circular economy that land is recycled. So what we're trying to do is try to find the most way of creating value and while cleaning these contaminated sites. So this is needed to achieve, I think, many goals. It's related to the new Soil Monitoring and Resilience Directive to make our contaminated soils more robust and usable and livable, and also to create value. So it's like, what are the options? What can you do to create, economic or other benefits if you're living on contaminated soil? So this is what we need, rather than just letting these sites be and making new development in sites that should be left alone.
But will you say then that the Aragon approach is different from other research projects dealing with contaminated land?
Yeah, I would say so. And it's mainly because in addition to just looking at risk and bioavailability, we are really trying to make a multidisciplinary approach with something that we call the Aragorn decision tree. But it's basically practical and holistic in terms of it starts with things like identifying the stakeholders, identifying the socioeconomic goals for the site. So it goes into that aspect as well. And then when it comes to what you're doing with the land, we also consider from multiple dimensions how to best achieve the impacts. So it's not, how can I say a recipe, oh, your site has levels of this, above this contamination, move the soil to the landfill, finished. No, it looks beyond to try to work with stakeholders to co-create value in how they will remediate their land for a certain purpose, so that while they are lowering risk from action, they might also be creating value. So it's trying to ultimately use a multidisciplinary co-creative approach involving multiple stakeholders to create as much value as possible from lowering the risk of a contaminated site. I'd put it that way. And so, and it's a team effort. So a big focus is get the village together and get a team of experts together, and then we find a way to co-create best solutions. Has
it been easy to achieve this holistic approach, creating a team to work together?
No, it's been a very highly rewarding approach. And I mean, we do have some momentum that we have funding to do this from the European Commission. So, I mean, I had a very inspiring time recently in Romania, where we went to a site that was contaminated with copper, Moldova it was. And we had we met with many people from the local village, the mayor, representatives from a mining company that was thinking of developing there, the local community. And we had a really very happy and positive conversation about what they could do and how they could create a new use of their land and opening, for instance, the mine in a sustainable way. And we were received well as experts. We were shown some traditional Romanian folk dances and had some great food, and it was a really happy experience. But of course, we did need the funding from the European Commission to set this up. But I mean, ultimately, we want this to happen on its own. This with the value of remediating to be on its own. So. So that's just my experience with that project. But it's like, I would like to see this energy, applied to different sites, that it's just more of a positive community-based way of restoring the environment.
You also have a role in ECHA, where you advise policymakers across Europe. What will you say are the most important measures to prioritize in the coming years? Because this is a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah, well, that's a very open and broad question, and also very, very broad. But I can say, in a lot of what I do with remediation, it always points the same way. The best solution would have always been to have prevented the pollution from occurring in the first place. And I really support some of the recent strategies that came out from the European Commission and ECHA, ECHA's implementing them. It's the European Commission that decides on these. But they had a lot of approaches that were focused on prevention, such as preventing the production of PFAS, except for the most essential uses. So there is a lot of discussion in ECHA now about what they call the general PFAS restriction, so that they see in what sectors is PFAS critical for society and where it's not, and then to phase out the uses where it's not, and also phase out the the ones that are causing the most harm. Recently, for instance, they banned PFAS containing firefighting foams, which has been a huge problem for soils. So this is a good example of preventative policy. Something that I really would try to encourage is that they're a bit more stricter on industrial emissions, because we know about the harm that came from these factories that polluted local communities, both long range and short range. And unfortunately, I've seen in the most recent updates that they're kind of rolling back on emission monitoring requirements from industry. I guess it's seen as a way of removing some regulatory burden, but I've been very vocal that I don't think that's a good idea. I think that there should at least be some reporting requirements on emissions, just so that we can better prepare and prevent future disasters like has occurred in the past. But this is something that I also think is important. So preventing emissions either by better tracking what industries are emitting into the environment, or preventing unnecessary contaminants from being made is where we need to focus.
How important will you say that your voice in ECHA is as a researcher?
Oh, that is another good question. But I do think it is an important voice because I bring a unique perspective. I would say definitely the academic and research world is underrepresented, and they know it. And also, to ECHA and the European Commission's credit, they are trying to find more ways for academics to have their say. And at the same time, it's up to people like the academic to try to be involved at this science policy interface. I would say it's not been used a lot because I think a lot of researchers, especially if they're in a university and they're not directly working with applied issues, they're just in their own academic bubble. But and there might not be as much of an economic incentive to influence policy as it would be, say, for industry. But I do think it is important for them to get out there because they can provide facts and data. They can say if something will not work based on their technical insight and provide guidance. And so I always encourage people to step up. And so that's something else that I try to do. I'm just one academic with my expertise, but I try to get them to talk with experts more that they might not normally talk with.
As we said before, this is a huge challenge. Finally, are you optimistic? Do you see signs that Europe is moving in the right direction when it comes to managing and reducing chemical soil pollution?
Well, at least, I mean, I'm optimistic that I can make positive change with the topics I'm working with, and just knowing that I can make a positive change doing what I do, it's the main reason why I do what I do. So, I mean, I think if I would, I know that there might be reasons for some people to be cynical when they see the overall situation and all these sustainable development goals not being reached. And I talk with a lot of people who are cynical and they just think, the time is ticking. But at least I felt in my career that I can make positive change doing the work that I'm doing. And so I just, and that's what keeps me going. So, and so if more people, I think, are out there like me who are optimistic and try to make changes, then I think we have a chance. So I just want to encourage that rather than sitting on the fence and being cynical or optimistic, but being involved and trying to make a positive change.
Thanks a lot, Hans Peter, for joining us and sharing your insights and for not sitting in your bubble, but also being involved in policy making and in broadcasting all the insight that you have. It's an honor to have you here. Thanks a lot.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Liv. Thank you very much.
And if you would like to learn more about what our skilled researchers are working on, you can find more episodes here in our podcast, Med blikket mot bakken. They are mainly in Norwegian, but we also have another podcast, NGI Technical. There you will find more episodes in English where researchers talk with other researchers and to researchers.